Sign the transfer, Jovelyn! Lavinia's voice was a jagged blade. Zulma needs this villa more than you need your success. I won't reward a troublemaker, I stated. The next second, the world turned scalding as she hurled the soup, their laughter echoing like a death knell. 72 hours later, they were the ones begging for mercy. But as I sit here now, that betrayal is still just a dark whisper in my mind. I push the dread aside, hoping for a miracle as I ease the car forward into the snow. The tires of my SUV crunched over the fresh powder of a Winnetka winter, the sound muffled by the heavy Chicago blizzard. Outside, the world was a blur of white and iron gray, but the Tudor-style villa before me glowed with an amber warmth that felt almost welcoming. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, watching the snow gather on the windshield. A home should be a sanctuary, a place where the walls hold your secrets and the floors echo with safety. For 10 years, I worked 12-hour shifts, traded my weekends for overtime, and navigated the shark-infested waters of corporate restructuring just to afford this view. I wanted to believe that by opening these doors to my family, I was finally bringing them into my peace. I stepped out, the Lake Michigan wind biting through my wool coat. Stepping into the foyer, the scent of expensive pine and cinnamon hit me, a nostalgic aroma that usually promised comfort. My mother, Lavinia, was already there, her posture as rigid as the antique furniture she adored. My father, Osred, stood by the fireplace, swirling a glass of scotch with a distant, glassy stare. I handed them my gifts, hand-selected, thoughtful pieces meant to bridge a decade of silence. Wealth isn't about what you possess, I told them, my voice steady despite the flutter in my chest, but about the peace you can provide for those you love. I wanted them to see that my success wasn't a barrier between us, but a bridge I had built with my own hands. The dinner table was a masterpiece of crystal and silver, yet the atmosphere was suffocating. My older sister Zulma sat across from me, her eyes tracking the movement of my hands, the sparkle of my watch, with a predatory hunger that made my skin crawl. Every smile from my parents felt practiced, a thin veil over a simmering resentment I couldn't quite name. "Jovelyn, dear," Zulma drawled, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "It must be so lonely in such a big house, especially for someone with your corporate ruthlessness. You hardly have time to enjoy it, do you?" I maintained my composure, cutting my steak with surgical precision. I've learned that family should be a harbor in a storm, not the storm itself. I remained silent, choosing dignity over a petty spat, but the dread in my stomach was beginning to freeze. The air in the room shifted the moment the main course was cleared. Lavinia didn't bring out the dessert. Instead, she placed a heavy, manila legal folder on the white lace tablecloth. The sound of it hitting the wood felt like a gavel. "We've been talking, Jovelyn," my mother began, her voice losing its festive lilt. "Zulma has had a difficult year. Her divorce, the market fluctuations. It's been hard. Since you have so much, it only makes sense for you to gift this villa to her. It's about family equity. It's about protecting the Carter legacy." I sat there, the silence stretching until I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. I looked at my mother, then at Osred, who refused to meet my gaze. "True charity begins at home," I said, my voice dropping an octave. "But it ends when it enables destruction. I am not gifting my life's work to fund Zulma's gambling debts and lack of accountability." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. Zulma's face contorted into a mask of pure spite, and Lavinia's eyes turned into flint. I realized then that to them, I wasn't a daughter who had achieved the American dream through grit and sacrifice. I was just an asset to be liquidated, a target they had been sizing up since the moment I signed the deed. Osred's continued silence was the loudest endorsement of their greed. I stood up, my chair scraping harshly against the floor. I had worked 80-hour weeks for this security, skipping vacations and packing lunches while Zulma burned through her inheritance on designer bags and bad bets. Honor is not a currency you can trade for a sister's mistakes, I told them, my heart hardening into a diamond of resolve. I wasn't going to be the family's sacrificial lamb anymore. I was a woman who knew the value of her own sweat, and I wasn't about to let them steal my dignity under the guise of family responsibility. I walked into the kitchen to clear my plate, needing a moment of cool air. That's when I saw it. Zulma's designer handbag was open on the marble island, a corner of a document peeking out. I shouldn't have looked, but the legal header caught my eye. Petition for involuntary guardianship. My breath hitched. I pulled the paper out just far enough to read the bolded text. They weren't just asking for the house. They had already filed a petition to declare me, Jovelyn Carter, mentally incapacitated due to extreme work-related stress. It was a predatory legal trap, a forged attempt to seize my entire estate without my consent. The insanity of it hit me like a physical blow. They had sat at my table, eaten my food, and accepted my gifts while holding a knife to my professional throat. My legal training took over, dampening the shock with a cold, analytical fire. I memorized the case number and the name of the notary, a man I knew had been disbarred in 3 other counties. They had crossed the line from toxic entitlement into a criminal conspiracy. I tucked the paper back exactly as I found it, my hands no longer trembling. I walked back into the dining room, my face a mask of absolute, terrifying calm. Lavinia was standing by the stove, her hand gripping the handle of a large pot of seafood soup. She looked at me with a strange, frantic energy in her eyes. "Are you ready to be a part of this family, Jovelyn?" she asked, her voice trembling with an edge I didn't recognize. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I knew the Christmas miracle I had hoped for was dead, and the 72-hour clock on their lives as I knew them had just begun. I didn't lose my family in that dining room. I lost the illusion that I ever had one. And as I looked at the case number on that forged document, I realized the war had already started. I was just the only one who knew the first move. The dining room had become a courtroom, and I was the only one without a lawyer. I sat back down, my movements deliberate and slow, despite the cold sweat prickling my spine. I looked at the manila folder, then at the 3 people who were supposed to be my safe harbor. "I don't withhold this house out of greed," I began, my voice carrying a forced serenity. "I do it to save us from our own excesses. A gift given to satisfy a vice is not a blessing, it's a curse." I wanted them to understand that true love is often found in the courage to say no when yes would be easier. I wasn't punishing Zulma. I was trying to stop her from drowning in her own choices. Zulma didn't see it that way. She leaned forward, her face twisted with a venomous intensity. "You heartless robot!" she hissed, her voice vibrating with a decade of resentment. "You value your spreadsheets and your market shares more than your own sister's survival. You're sitting on $500,000 while I'm struggling to breathe." Beside her, Osred remained a statue of cowardice, his eyes fixed firmly on his plate as if the patterned china held the secrets of the universe. He didn't speak. He didn't defend me. He simply allowed the psychological battery to continue, his silence serving as a perfect endorsement for my sister's vitriol. The atmosphere grew suffocatingly thick, the festive decorations now feeling like ironic props in a tragedy. Lavinia stood up, her silhouette blocking the warm light of the chandelier. The mask of the doting mother was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp authority that I finally recognized as a weapon. "You've always been the difficult one, Jovelyn," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Always too smart for your own good, too independent. But family isn't a business deal you can negotiate away." I stood my ground, my posture stoic even as my heart felt like it was being squeezed by an iron fist. That's when I noticed her hand tightening around the heavy ceramic bowl of seafood soup. I turned to leave, sensing the air had become toxic beyond repair. I didn't get more than 2 steps. The world suddenly exploded into a blur of heat and ceramic shards. The scalding seafood soup hit the back of my head and shoulders, soaking through my wool sweater and searing into my skin. But the heat wasn't the worst part. Within seconds, a jagged chemical sting began to pulse across my neck and near my eyes. A sharp, acidic burn that didn't belong in a kitchen. Zulma had added industrial cleaning agents to the pot. They weren't just trying to humiliate me, they were trying to scar me. I fell to my knees, gasping for air as the liquid stung my eyes. The pain was rhythmic, a throbbing reminder of the betrayal. Through the haze, I looked up at my mother. I didn't see a parent, I saw a predator. I am not crying because of the heat, Mother. I managed to whisper, my voice thick with a profound, quiet pity. I am crying for the version of you that I thought loved me. Zulma let out a sharp, jagged laugh that echoed off the high ceilings, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. Osred finally looked up, his expression one of mild annoyance rather than horror. You should have just signed the papers, Jovelyn, he muttered, reaching for his wine. The realization hit me harder than the soup. This wasn't a moment of losing control. It was a calculated attempt to disfigure my spirit or shock my body into submission so they could guide my hand to those guardianship papers. The house was just the bait. They wanted the soul that built it. I realized then that my name hadn't just been forgotten in this house. It had been erased. I was no longer a daughter. I was a resource they were willing to dismantle to get what they wanted. I didn't scream. I didn't give them the satisfaction of my agony. Instead, I stood up slowly, the liquid dripping onto the expensive hardwood floor. I reached for a pristine silk napkin from the table and used it to wipe the soup from my face with a cinematic, steady hand. It was a declaration of autonomy. I spoke with a clarity that seemed to suck the air out of the room. You haven't taken my home. You've only given me the permission I needed to leave yours forever. I looked at them one last time, seeing 3 strangers who shared my DNA but nothing of my spirit. I walked out into the Chicago blizzard without a coat, the freezing wind a mercy against the chemical heat on my skin. As I reached my car, I pulled out my phone and activated a preset security protocol I had designed months ago. My legal mind remained sharp, reminding me that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. I wasn't just leaving, I was starting a counteroffensive. I had 72 hours to dismantle the structures they thought protected them. I was going to show them that a woman who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in the room. I put the SUV in gear and drove away, watching the villa disappear in the rearview mirror. As the tires cleared the driveway, the smart locks on the house engaged with a heavy, mechanical thud. I had changed the master codes remotely. They were now trapped inside my property, sitting in the dark of their own making, while I had the head start I needed to see Eustace. The war had moved from the dining table to the shadows, and I was finally playing by my own rules. As the soup crusted on my coat and the chemical sting pulsed on my forehead, I realized the woman who walked into that house was dead. The woman driving away now was a stranger to them, and their worst nightmare. The downtown Chicago hotel suite was silent, a sterile vacuum of white marble and glass that felt worlds away from the suffocating Tudor walls of Winnetka. I sat by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the sunrise bleed a pale, bruised purple over the frozen horizon of Lake Michigan. Christmas morning. In a different life, I would be brewing coffee for my parents, perhaps laughing as Zulma complained about the cold. Instead, I was pressing a cold compress to the throbbing chemical burns on my shoulder, my skin a map of the betrayal I had barely escaped. Eustace sat across from me, his face a grim mask of focus as a forensic technician dismantled my secondary phone on the mahogany desk between us. The silence was methodical, broken only by the rhythmic clicking of a keyboard. I found myself contemplating the hollow nature of forgiveness. For years, I believed that turning the other cheek was a sign of strength, a way to maintain the moral high ground. But as the technician's screen began to glow with lines of code that didn't belong to me, the truth became undeniable. Forgiveness without boundaries isn't a virtue. It's just a permission slip for further abuse. I didn't hate them. Hatred requires an emotional investment I no longer possessed. I simply refused to remain a resource for their predation. The technician paused, his eyes narrowing behind thick lenses. "We found it," he whispered, turning the monitor toward us. "It's a mirroring software, high grade. It's been capturing every keystroke, every password, every corporate email you've sent for the last 8 months. My breath hitched as the digital trail led back to a private server registered in a residential basement. Not a hacker in Eastern Europe. Not a corporate rival. The IP address belonged to Osred, my father. The man who taught me how to ride a bike had spent the last year as the eye in my pocket, stealing my trade secrets to bail out his own failing offshore investments. He hadn't been silent at that dinner table out of fear of Lavinia. He was silent because he was already finished with me. I was just a ghost. He was still milking for data. I felt a chill that no radiator could touch. However, the Jovelyn who had walked into that villa was gone. I looked at Eustace and nodded. "Don't wipe it," I commanded, my voice flat and cold. "Feed it. Create a dummy encrypted file titled Private Safe Codes, Winnetka Villa. Let them think I'm hiding cash in the walls. Let's see how far their greed will push them into the light." By noon, Eustace returned with a stack of documents from the Winnetka County Clerk's office. His hand trembled slightly as he laid them out. There was a life insurance policy I never applied for, and a codicil to my will that bore a signature so close to mine it made my stomach turn. I read the death benefit clause aloud, the words tasting like ash. If I were to die under accidental circumstances, every liquid asset, every stock option, and the $500,000 villa would transfer immediately to Zulma. The soup attack suddenly lost its status as a mere outburst of maternal rage. With the industrial cleaners Zulma had added, they weren't just trying to humiliate me. They knew about my history of severe respiratory allergies. They were trying to trigger anaphylaxis, a lethal, accidental reaction that would leave no marks but a closed casket. Wealth is only a blessing if it's earned with honor. When it's sought through blood, it becomes a shroud for the soul. I looked at the burn on my neck in the mirror. They didn't want my house. They wanted my life, and they wanted it to look like a tragedy. I turned to the window. The gray slush on the streets below, a reflection of the family bond that had dissolved into something unrecognizable. "I am not destroying them, Eustace," I said, my voice barely a whisper against the glass. "I am simply removing the pedestal I built for them to look down on me from." I wasn't an embittered daughter seeking revenge. I was a woman reclaiming her right to exist without being a target. I instructed Eustace to initiate the financial freeze. It was time to pull the plug on the life support I had provided for their delusions. The legal counterstrike was rhythmic and decisive. Within an hour, I had revoked the power of attorney Lavinia had used to manage my local affairs. I moved to freeze the trust accounts that paid for Zulma's Porsche lease and Osred's country club dues. According to Illinois law, the evidence of the assault gave me the standing to file an emergency protective order, which I did with surgical precision. I was creating an ironclad paper trail that would withstand any lie Lavinia could craft on social media. I sat back, the hotel room darkening as the short winter day began to fade. My phone sat on the table, silent for the moment, but I knew the storm was coming. The alerts would be hitting their devices now. The credit cards would be declining at the luxury boutiques where Zulma spent her afternoons. The automated emails from the bank would be notifying Osred that his guarantor had withdrawn her support. I felt a strange sense of mourning, not for the people they were, but for the people I had pretended they were for 30 years. Have you ever had to choose between your blood and your life? It is a heavy, lonely realization that the people who gave you life are the ones trying to take it. But as the 72-hour clock ticked toward the second day, I felt a new kind of power. It wasn't the power of money or influence. It was the power of the truth. I was no longer waiting for their blow to fall. I was the storm. I watched the digital map Eustace had set up. Zulma's car GPS showed her stopping abruptly in front of a high-end mall on Michigan Avenue. I could almost hear the sound of the plastic card being handed back, the embarrassed flush on her face, the realization that the fountain had run dry. The first card had declined. The bridge I had spent 10 years building was finally, mercifully, on fire. "It started," Eustace said, looking at his own screen. "Lavinia is calling. 17 times in the last 5 minutes." I didn't reach for the phone. I didn't need to hear their screeching demands or their manufactured tears. I knew what was coming. They would turn to the safe I had hinted at in the dummy data. They would scurry toward the bait like rats in a maze. And I would be there, in the silence of my own strength, watching them prove exactly who they were to the world. The phone began to vibrate again, skittering across the marble table like a dying insect. It wasn't an apology. It was the frantic, ugly noise of people who realized their golden goose had finally grown claws. I closed my eyes and let the silence of the room wrap around me. The morning of December 26th arrived with a biting, surgical cold that seemed to match the clinical atmosphere of Eustace's private office. I stood by the window, watching the pedestrians in the Chicago legal district hurry along the salt-stained sidewalks, their breaths forming small, temporary clouds in the air. My reflection in the glass was a stranger's, pale, with a high-collared sweater hiding the chemical burns on my neck. I felt like a clock that had been wound too tight, every gear humming with a strategic vibration that kept the emotional collapse at bay. Eustace cleared his throat behind me, the sound echoing off the rows of leather-bound law books that lined his walls. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he slid a series of old, yellowed financial ledgers across his oak desk, documents he had unearthed from a dormant corporate audit. I sat down, my fingers grazing the cold paper. As I turned the pages, a dark, hidden chapter of my early career in Chicago began to reveal itself. I saw my father Osred's signature, shaky but definitive, next to Lavinia's elegant, predatory script. They had taken out a massive predatory loan against my future earnings nearly 8 years ago, using a forged power of attorney to bail out Zulma's first major gambling scandal. I had been sold before I even knew I was a commodity. They hadn't just expected me to succeed. They had bonded my very potential to the debts of a sister who refused to grow up. Every late night at the firm, every skipped meal, every ounce of stress I endured was being siphoned off to pay for a lie I was never told. I don't regret the hard work. The grit made me who I am. But I mourn for the love that was sold for a price tag. I looked at Eustace and felt a profound, heavy sadness for the child Jovelyn, who thought she was working for her family's pride when she was actually just working off their secret ransom. True honor is not found in paying for others' sins, I whispered, my voice sounding hollow in the large room. It is found in reclaiming the right to your own life. I realized the duty I felt for 30 years was a manufactured weight, a leash disguised as a necklace. I closed the ledger with a soft thud that felt like a burial. The debt was settled, but the cost to my soul had been immense. I was no longer a bonded asset. I was a free agent, and the people who held the contract were about to find out that the collateral had walked away. The investigative phase shifted to the digital realm. I opened my laptop and accessed the administrative network of the Winnetka Villa. For months, I had noticed unusual spikes in data usage during my business trips, a ghostly digital footprint that didn't match my parents' limited online habits. I navigated through the server logs with surgical precision, tracing the traffic to a high-speed router hidden in the basement. What I found made the chemical burns on my skin feel cold by comparison. Zulma had been running a sophisticated investment livestream studio from my own home. I watched recorded clips of my sister wearing my professional blazers, sitting in my library, using a forged lawyer ID with my credentials to lure unsuspecting retirees into a cryptocurrency scam. She wasn't just a troublemaker anymore. She was an active predator, using the hard-earned reputation of Jovelyn Carter as a weapon for fraud. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. She was building a prison with my bricks, using my name to destroy the lives of people who, like me, just wanted security. I captured the digital evidence, every bite of it, ensuring the metadata was ironclad for federal authorities. Justice is a slow-moving river, but it eventually washes away the structures built on lies. I watched Zulma's face on the screen, her eyes bright with the thrill of the con, and I felt a total detachment. She wasn't my sister. She was a threat to the innocent, and my silence was no longer an option. I was providing the bars for a prison she had been decorating for years. Eustace checked his tablet, his brow furrowed. "The alerts are working," he noted. "Their cards are being declined at the grocery stores and gas stations. Zulma's SUV is flagged for repossession. They are starting to panic." I imagined them now, trapped in the villa, the luxury they felt entitled to suddenly becoming a gilded cage with no exit. Lavinia's voice would be rising in that frantic, shrill tone she used when the world didn't bend to her will. Osred would be retreating further into his scotch. A man who had sold his daughter's safety for a quiet life that was now screaming. Despite the betrayal, a small, stubborn part of my heart remained human. I didn't want to become like them, devoid of empathy. I instructed Eustace to make a small, anonymous payment directly to the utility provider for the villa. "I will not see them freeze," I said, my heart hardening into a diamond of resolve, for that would be returning evil for evil. But I will not see them steal, for that would be allowing the rot to continue. I was defining my new boundaries. I would ensure they had heat in a Chicago blizzard, but I would not provide the luxury they used to mock me. As the 48-hour mark passed, my phone buzzed with a voicemail from Lavinia. I didn't listen to all of it. The first 10 seconds were enough. Her voice was a toxic mixture of screeching demands and manufactured tears, calling me a monster for starving my own mother. I deleted it without a second thought. The guilt that used to control me had been cauterized by the truth. I sat in the quiet office, the ticking clock the only sound in the room, and prepared for the final 24 hours of my plan. The phone buzzed again, this time a notification from a social media monitoring tool Eustace had set up. Lavinia had just uploaded a video. I could see the thumbnail, her sitting in the living room, a handkerchief to her eyes, the Christmas tree in the background. She was starting the public execution of my character. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel the urge to explain myself to the world. I knew that within 24 hours, the truth would be the only thing left standing. I watched the livestream footage one last time, Zulma promising guaranteed returns to a grandfather in Florida. She was so confident, so sure that I would always be the quiet one who absorbed the damage. She didn't realize that the quiet one is usually the one who hears everything. I closed the laptop, the light reflecting off my eyes with a cold, predatory focus of my own. It was time to provide the bars. The glow of the laptop screen was the only thing anchoring me to reality as the clock struck 6. 48 hours had passed since the soup incident, and the silence from my end was intentional, yet it felt like a leaden weight. Eustace sat in the corner of his office, his face obscured by the steam of a black coffee, while I watched the storm break online. Lavinia had finally made her move. She hadn't called or texted, she had gone straight for my jugular, my reputation. The video was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation. I watched my mother, her eyes red-rimmed and her hair artfully disheveled, sitting on the sofa of the Winnetka villa. She looked like a frail grandmother abandoned in the cold. My youngest daughter, Jovelyn, the one I sacrificed everything for, she sobbed into a lace handkerchief, has locked us out of our own accounts. She's trying to take our home while we freeze in this blizzard. She's become so consumed by her corporate success that she's forgotten the woman who gave her life. It was a public execution of my character, masterfully edited to strip away the context of her assault and replace it with a narrative of elder abuse. Within minutes, the viral tide began to rise. My professional email started pinging with urgent inquiries from clients who had seen the video. The Winnetka community forums were already alight with residents calling me a monster and a shame to the neighborhood. I felt the familiar, sharp sting of indignation, the urge to scream the truth from the rooftops. But I remained stoic. The truth doesn't need to scream to be heard. It only needs to wait for the noise of lies to exhaust itself. I turned the laptop toward Eustace and told him to maintain radio silence. I would not engage in a mudslinging battle with a woman who had already sold her soul for a piece of real estate. By mid-evening, the remote surveillance feed from the villa showed the next phase of their desperate counter-move. Lavinia and Zulma, convinced that my silence was a sign of surrender, had invited a shady private attorney into the house. I watched them through the high-definition cameras I had secretly upgraded weeks prior. They were sitting at my dining table, the same table where the soup had been thrown, signing papers with a frantic, greedy energy. Zulma was pointing toward the mahogany clock on the wall, likely discussing which pieces of furniture were worth the most at auction. They believed they were winning because I hadn't pushed back. They were unaware that every forged signature and every fraudulent declaration of my incapacity was being recorded and uploaded to a secure federal cloud server. I watched Osred hesitantly point toward my private office safe, his hand trembling as he betrayed the last of my secrets. A man who sells his child's safety for his own comfort has already lost everything worth keeping. I felt a profound pity for him. A man who had spent his life hiding in the shadows of stronger women, only to find himself a co-conspirator in a felony. Their greed had completely blinded them to the legal reality. By using the forged guardianship papers to invite a third party to appraise and seize assets, they were no longer in the territory of a civil family dispute. They were committing grand larceny, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy in real time. I sat in my hotel room, my neck still stinging from the chemical burns, and realized that my eventual victory would be more than just personal. It would be a judicial dismantling of a toxic system they had spent decades building. Eustace stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. "They're taking the bait," he whispered. I nodded, the light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes with a cold, strategic focus. Jovelyn Carter had never fled. I had deliberately left the side gate and the basement access slightly compromised, a malfunction I had noted in my home maintenance logs weeks ago. It was the 72-hour decoy. I had provided them with the perfect opportunity to enter the property illegally and begin the unauthorized liquidation of assets. Under Illinois law, they were no longer considered relatives staying in the house. They were illegal intruders committing robbery. By making them believe they had the upper hand, I lured them into a situation where no mother's tears or heartbreaking stories on social media could save them. Sometimes you have to let the fire die down to see the ashes of the truth. I didn't act for revenge. I acted because I needed to end a vicious cycle of violence that had been passed down like a cursed family heirloom. As the night deepened, the footage showed them drinking my most expensive wine, celebrating their victory in the basement studio Zulma had used for her scams. They looked happy, toast after toast raised to their new life. It was a chilling display of sociopathic entitlement. Lavinia raised a glass toward the mahogany clock, unaware that the camera lens behind its face was broadcasting her confession of finally getting rid of that brat to a law enforcement server. They thought they had finally caged me, but they were the ones who had just walked into the cell. I closed my laptop and let the darkness of the hotel room wrap around me. The 48-hour mark had passed, and the final 24 hours of my plan were now in motion. I felt a strange, quiet power. Not the kind that comes from money, but the kind that comes from being the only person in a room who knows the whole story. When the sun rose, the police wouldn't be looking for the abusive daughter. They would be coming for the predators who were currently celebrating their own downfall. The phone on the bedside table buzzed once. A text from Eustace. "The warrant is signed. We move at dawn." I didn't reply. I just laid back on the bed and closed my eyes. The war was almost over, and for the first time since I was a child, I wasn't afraid of the noise. I was the silence that was about to break it. The dawn was barely a gray smudge on the horizon when the first police cruiser rolled quietly into the driveway of the Winnetka villa. I arrived exactly at the 70th hour, stepping out of Eustace's car as the winter air swirled with a biting, rhythmic intensity. I didn't sneak in through the side gate I had left malfunctioning. I walked straight up the front driveway, my heels clicking on the salt-stained pavement like a countdown. Eustace and a team of officers stood by my side, looking at the Tudor facade that had once been my sanctuary, but was now a brilliantly lit crime scene. The front door burst open before we even reached the porch. Lavinia and Zulma rushed out, still draped in my expensive silk robes, clutching glasses of my vintage wine as if they were scepters. "Jovelyn, this place is not yours! Get out of here!" Zulma screamed, her face flushed with a dangerous, entitled heat. "We don't like your presence. You've already been erased from this family's future." Behind them, Osred cowered in the foyer shadows, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to meet the gaze of the daughter he had siphoned data from for months. I stood my ground with a piercing calm that seemed to drop the temperature of the morning even further. True family is a circle of strength and love, but when it becomes a cage of debt, the only honorable thing to do is break the lock. I reached up, slowly pulling back my high collar to reveal the raw, chemical burn on my neck, the physical proof of their love. "I didn't come for the house," I told them, my voice cutting through the wind like a razor. "I came to return the poison you gave me." I signaled to Eustace, who activated the external media feed we had spent the last 24 hours preparing. The digital execution began with a blinding light. A massive, high-definition projection screen, mounted on a van parked at the curb, flickered to life, broadcasting the Winnetka Villa's internal security feed to the entire street. Neighbors who had been woken by the sirens peered through their curtains as the footage of the soup attack played in a looped, brutal clarity. The socialite queen, Lavinia, was shown in high definition, her face a mask of rage as she hurled the pot. Then came the clips of Zulma's basement studio, her voice promising guaranteed returns to retirees while wearing my blazer. Publicity is the best disinfectant for the rot that grows in the dark. The community watched in stunned silence as Lavinia's confession about the fake guardianship played through the high-powered speakers. "We'll just say Jovelyn is crazy." Her recorded voice boomed across the snowy lawns. "Stress from the firm. Then everything she has is ours." The social and legal credit Lavinia had spent 30 years cultivating evaporated in 60 seconds. The police stepped forward, the metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the cold air as they moved toward Zulma for fraud and Lavinia for felony assault. Lavinia snapped, her face losing every shred of maternal pretense. "You destroyed us!" she shrieked as an officer gripped her arm. "You destroyed your own flesh and blood over a pile of bricks." I didn't flinch. I felt a strange, detached peace as I looked at her. "You can't destroy what was never built on love," I countered, my voice steady and unwavering. "You only destroyed the mirror I used to look at you through. The version of you I loved was a lie, and the truth is, the only thing that can't be stolen." As Zulma was led toward the cruiser, sobbing about her reputation, Lavinia lunged toward the gate for one final, desperate strike. "You think you're so smart, Jovelyn? You think you're better than us?" She spat, her voice a toxic rasp. "You're nothing but a biological spare. You were adopted from a third cousin just because you were a perfect match donor for Zulma's kidney failure when she was 6. We didn't want a daughter. We wanted an insurance policy." The air seemed to vanish from the driveway. Eustace moved to steady me, but I didn't move. The bloodless truth hit me with a weight that should have crushed me, but instead, it felt like the final severing of a cursed cord. I wasn't a daughter. I was a resource to be harvested at will, a living medicine cabinet. I looked at Lavinia, the woman who had held me not out of affection, but to ensure the asset remained healthy for the real child. "Thank you for that truth," I whispered, a faint cold smile appearing on my lips. It was the last thread holding me to this poison. Now I am not just independent. I am finally free from your history. I turned to the police sergeant and handed him the final encrypted drive containing Zulma's money laundering logs. "She's all yours," I said, my voice empty of malice but full of justice. Zulma begged me to pay her bail, her eyes wide with the terror she had earned. I simply turned my back. Mercy without accountability is just an invitation for the predator to return, and I was finished being the prey. I watched the taillights of the cruisers disappear into the Winnetka gray, the sirens fading until only the sound of the wind remained. Lavinia looked at me with the eyes of a stranger who had lost a prize, not a mother who had lost a child. As the last cruiser turned the corner, the silence of the neighborhood returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the silence of secrets. It was the silence of a foundation being cleared. I realized my real life hadn't started 10 years ago when I made my first million. It was starting right now, in the silence of my own strength. The soft, pressurized hum of O'Hare International Airport provided the first real peace I had known in a decade. It was dawn on December 28th, 72 hours exactly since I walked out into a Winnetka blizzard with soup drying on my neck. I sat in a secluded corner of the Delta Sky Club, the sky outside the terminal windows bleeding a pale, hopeful gold over the tarmac. Eustace sat across from me, his briefcase open, the last of the mahogany-scented memories of my old life laid out in crisp white paper. We were here for the final legal severance, the moment where I stopped being a target and started being a person again. I took the silver pen Eustace offered and signed the final quitclaim deeds for the villa. It was a methodical process, each stroke of the pen a rhythmic pulse of liberation. I chose to donate the property to a foundation for victims of domestic and financial abuse, the very kind of predation my family had perfected. A home is only a sanctuary when it's built on respect. Otherwise, it's just a beautiful prison. By turning that Tudor-style cage into a gift for others, I was finally washing the chemical sting from its walls. I felt a profound sense of detachment, a stoic grace that allowed me to look at the documents without the phantom weight of guilt. Eustace provided a final status update before my flight. Lavinia and Zulma were officially facing multiple felony charges, including grand larceny and aggravated assault. Because of the federal wire fraud evidence from Zulma's scam studio, their social and legal credit was liquidated beyond repair. There would be no bail paid by me, no high-priced defense funded by my overtime hours. Justice isn't about making others suffer, but about ensuring they can no longer make you suffer. I listened to the report with a quiet heart, neither celebrating their downfall nor mourning their absence. I was simply an observer of a fire they had started themselves. As I stood up to head toward the gate, my secondary phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a voicemail from Osred. I paused, the scent of jet fuel and expensive coffee grounding me in the present. I pressed play, and his voice filled the air, trembling, desperate, and hollow. He wasn't calling to apologize for the mirroring software or for watching my mother assault me. He was calling because the winter utility bills were due, the legal retainers were mounting, and the pedestal he had lived on had finally crumbled. He sounded small, like a man who had realized too late that silence has a price. I listened to the end, my heart remaining entirely quiet. I didn't feel the old surge of duty or the desperate need to fix his life. I spoke a final truth to the empty terminal air, a silent prayer of closure. I forgive you not because you deserve it, but because I deserve to carry a heart that is light. I instructed Eustace to establish a minimal court-ordered maintenance fund for Osred's basic needs, enough for a modest apartment and groceries. It was an act of distant kindness, a way to ensure he wouldn't starve, but it was also a wall. Boundaries are the highest form of self-love. I would provide the bread, but I would never again provide the soul. Boarding the plane felt like a cinematic ascent. I carried only a small leather bag and my reclaimed dignity, leaving behind the folders, the drama, and the chemical burns. I found my seat and watched through the oval window as the Chicago skyline began to shrink into a grid of toy buildings and gray slush. I thought of a line I'd read once, something about how you cannot find peace by avoiding life, but by outgrowing the people who make life impossible. The 72-hour war was over. It had been the labor pain of my true birth, a violent but necessary transition from asset to human being. I reached into my bag and pulled out my new passport, a clean slate under a new legal identity I had established through Eustace. Jovelyn Carter was a name associated with an insurance policy, an organ donor, and a corporate bank. The woman sitting in seat 4A was someone else entirely. I was no longer a resource to be harvested. I was a woman who owned her own time. As the plane reached cruising altitude and the clouds became a vast white ocean beneath us, the tension that had lived in my shoulders for 30 years finally dissolved. I leaned back and closed my eyes, the pressurized air of the cabin feeling cleaner than the pine-scented halls of Winnetka. I wasn't going to a house. I wasn't looking for a sanctuary in bricks and mortar. I had realized during those 72 hours that a sanctuary is something you carry inside you, built with the bricks of your own self-respect. I felt a faint, genuine smile touch my lips, the first one in a long, long time. I was at peace with the silence because for the first time it was my silence, not theirs. The flight attendant moved down the aisle, her voice a gentle interruption. "Are you going home, ma'am?" she asked, offering a small smile. I looked at the vast, open sky, the horizon stretching out forever without a single manila folder or forged signature in sight. For the first time in 29 years, the answer was a resonant, internal yes. I wasn't going to a house. I was becoming my own. You can't heal wounds in the very environment that made you sick. A house is just wood and stone, but your self-respect is a sanctuary that only you can build. I chose my peace over their greed, and for the first time in my life, I finally found my home.